felt this before. A fear that makes no sense given your actual history. A skill that came too easily, like your hands already knew. A reaction to something, a person, a place, a situation that felt too big for what was actually happening. Like you were responding to more than just this moment, more than just your own experience. There's a reason for that, and it lives in your cells, in the molecular structure that built your body from the moment of conception, in the twisted ladder of your DNA. Your ancestors left you more than genetics, more than eye color and bone structure and predisposition to certain diseases. They left you memory. Actual, measurable, scientifically observable memory encoded in the very substance that makes you physically exist. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this works. You're carrying something, things you didn't generate through your own experience, and understanding what those things are changes how you work with your own patterns. We're going to get practical toward the end. There's an approach I'll guide you through for actually accessing what's stored in your cells, for distinguishing between what's yours and what was deposited before you arrived. So hang tight. We're going to map this out properly. We need to establish what DNA actually is before we discuss what it carries, because the simplified understanding misses exactly what makes ancestral memory possible. Your DNA is a molecule, a physical structure made of atoms arranged in a specific pattern. The famous double helix, the twisted ladder. If you uncoiled all the DNA in a single cell of your body and stretched it out, it would extend about 6 feet long. Now, multiply that by the roughly 37 trillion cells in your body. The total length of DNA in your body would stretch to the sun and back about 600 times. That's measurement, molecular fact. An almost incomprehensible amount of information storage packed into a form you can't see without a microscope. The standard teaching says DNA contains the instructions for building your body, which proteins to make, how to construct tissues and organs, the blueprint of your physical form, and that's accurate as far as it goes, but it goes further. Think of DNA as a library rather than a blueprint. A library contains far more than construction manuals. It contains histories, stories, records of what happened and how people responded. Your DNA is that kind of library. It holds the construction instructions, yes, and it holds the record of what your lineage experienced and how they adapted. The specificity matters now. For decades, scientists assumed that while DNA carried genetic information, the actual experiences of an individual couldn't modify what got passed down. Your grandfather's trauma was his trauma. Your mother's learned skills were her skills. The genes you inherited were fixed at conception, and nothing that happened during their lifetimes could change what you received. That assumption collapsed. The field that changed everything is called epigenetics. Epi means above or on top of. So epigenetics refers to what sits on top of your genes, modifying how they express without changing the underlying sequence. Picture it this way. If your DNA is a massive library, the genes themselves are the books. You inherit the complete collection from both parents. But not every book is open. Not every page is readable. Some books have bookmarks in them, keeping certain sections accessible. Other books are dusty on high shelves, essentially closed. Still others have notes written in the margins, comments from previous readers about what to pay attention to. Epigenetics is the system of bookmarks and margin notes. It determines which genes are actively expressed and which remain dormant, which instructions your cells actually read and follow, and which instructions they ignore. What matters for ancestral memory is this. Those bookmarks and margin notes can be modified by experience. What your ancestors lived through, especially intense experiences, left marks on how their genes expressed. And those marks, those epigenetic modifications, can be transmitted to offspring. Makes sense? The research confirms this beyond reasonable doubt. In 2013, researchers at Emory University published a study that shifted the entire conversation. They exposed mice to the scent of cherry blossoms while simultaneously delivering a mild electric shock. The mice learned to fear that specific scent. Classical conditioning. Pavlov's dogs, same principle. But then they bred those mice. The offspring, who had never been exposed to cherry blossom scent or any shock, showed fear responses to that same scent. And their offspring, the grandchildren of the originally conditioned mice, also showed the response. Fear of a scent that no mouse in those later generations had ever encountered, paired with danger. The researchers found actual structural changes in the brains of the descendant mice. More neurons sensitive to that specific odor. The fear memory had modified gene expression in the smell receptors, and that modification passed through sperm to subsequent generations. Think about what this means. A learned fear, created through experience, became biological inheritance. The descendants carried the pattern without ever having the experience that generated it. Molecular biology published in peer-reviewed journals, observable and repeatable. Research on human populations tells similar stories. Studies of children conceived during severe famines, the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 and 45 being the most documented, show epigenetic modifications that persist for generations. The children and grandchildren of those who experienced starvation show altered metabolism, higher rates of certain health conditions, changes in how their bodies process nutrients. The famine ended, but the biological memory of scarcity continued expressing in descendants who never missed a meal. Research on the descendants of Holocaust survivors revealed elevated stress hormones in offspring, altered cortisol regulation that matched patterns of chronic trauma exposure. These children didn't experience the camps. They were born years or decades later. Yet their bodies showed the signature of extreme stress, inherited through epigenetic modifications to how their stress response systems developed. Are you tracking this? What I'm describing is concrete, observable in your biology, your nervous system, your stress response, your metabolic patterns, your sensitivity to certain triggers. All of it carries the fingerprints of what happened before you were born, written into your cells, readable in your biology. We need to go further than mainstream science has gone. Because while epigenetics explains the mechanism, contemplative traditions understood the phenomenon long before microscopes could observe methylation patterns on chromosomes. The Kemetic tradition, the wisdom lineage of ancient Egypt, built an entire science of ancestral transmission. They understood the vital force as something that flows through bloodlines. When the texts describe royal lineages and the importance of succession, they're describing the transmission of accumulated spiritual development, the Ka carrying memory, capacity, and alignment across generations. The pharaoh was understood as a convergence point for an entire civilization's ancestral field. The initiatic training of pharaohs included specific practices for accessing and integrating ancestral memory, for receiving the wisdom that previous generations had developed and deposited into the lineage. Technology built on direct observation of how consciousness and biology interweave. Tamil Siddha tradition, the lineage of accomplished practitioners in South India, developed explicit teachings about memory stored in bone and marrow. Thirumoolar's Tirumantiram speaks of how the body carries accumulated pattern from lineage. The bones in particular were understood as crystallized energy, holding information from ancestors. The Siddhars developed practices specifically targeting the marrow, for accessing what the marrow carries, for working with the ancestral deposit stored in the deepest physical layer of the body. Bhogar, one of the 18 Siddhars, allegedly worked with alchemy as a way of purifying the body's stored patterns, ancestral residue that no longer served the practitioner's evolution. The alchemical processes he developed were designed to transform what had been deposited across generations, clearing the inherited material so the practitioner could operate from clear ground rather than accumulated burden. Kashmir Shaivism provides perhaps the most sophisticated philosophical framework for understanding how this works. Kashamaraja, in the Heart of Recognition, describes how consciousness contracts to take form. This contraction follows patterns, tendencies that have accumulated across manifestations. The tradition distinguishes between immediate cause and distant cause. Your parents are immediate cause of your body. But the patterns that express through your body, the tendencies and vulnerabilities and capacities you carry, have distant cause stretching back through the entire lineage that produced the conditions of your birth. What modern science calls epigenetic inheritance, these traditions called the transmission of accumulated tendency through the vehicle of form. Different vocabulary pointing at the same observable phenomenon. We're about to get into specific categories of what actually gets transmitted. Hang tight. Ancestral memory includes several distinct types of inherited information, each working through different mechanisms and serving different functions. The first category is survival responses, fears, vigilance patterns, threat sensitivities calibrated by what your ancestors encountered. If your lineage survived persecution, displacement, famine, or violence, your nervous system likely carries elevated baseline alertness, a tendency toward hypervigilance that makes no sense given your actual circumstances, but made complete sense for ancestors who needed exactly that heightened awareness to survive. This is what the mouse studies demonstrated at the molecular level, but it extends far beyond simple fears. Complex patterns of social caution, trust hesitancy, sensitivity to certain types of threats while remaining oblivious to others, all of it calibrated by generations of accumulated experience about what was actually dangerous in the specific environments your ancestors inhabited. Think about what I just said. Your fear responses were calibrated by environments you've never seen, threats you've never faced, conditions that may have ended centuries ago. You're running ancestral software in modern circumstances, and when the software doesn't match the current environment, you experience what looks like irrational fear, excessive caution, or misplaced anxiety. The second category is behavioral tendencies, ways of responding to situations that seem to come naturally. Research on animal populations shows learned behaviors transmitting across generations even without direct teaching. Primates in separate populations develop strikingly similar tool use patterns. Birds in isolated groups develop similar songs. Something beyond individual learning is at work. In humans, this shows up as aptitudes and inclinations that appear too early to be explained by this life learning. A child drawn to music before ever receiving instruction. Someone with natural mechanical understanding despite no exposure to mechanics. Hands that seem to know how to do things the conscious mind hasn't learned. The third category is unprocessed emotional material. This is where ancestral inheritance gets more challenging. When your ancestors experienced overwhelming situations, grief or rage or terror that couldn't be fully processed in their lifetime, the energetic signature of that incomplete processing can transmit forward. This differs from inherited skill or calibrated fear response. This is unfinished business. Emotional weight that previous generations couldn't discharge, passed down like debt to be paid by descendants. You've probably felt this if you've ever had a grief response that exceeded its apparent cause, rage that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the triggering situation, sorrow that feels ancient rather than personal. You may have been feeling through ancestral residue rather than just your own emotional response. The fourth category is wisdom and capacity, because ancestral inheritance carries gifts alongside burden. Your lineage also deposited developed capacities, hard-won wisdom earned through generations of experience, seeds of potential planted by ancestors who wanted their descendants to have advantages they themselves had to struggle to develop. You feel that? This is what the Kemetic tradition emphasized in their teachings about ancestral veneration. You inherit evolution from your ancestors, their refinement, the fruits of their spiritual work deposited into the lineage for future generations to access and build upon. We've covered significant ground. The mechanism of epigenetic inheritance, how experience modifies gene expression and transmits across generations. The scientific research validating what traditions understood intuitively. The different categories of ancestral memory, survival responses, behavioral tendencies, unprocessed emotional material, and deposited wisdom. If this is landing, if it's clarifying something about your own patterns or raising questions you want to explore, drop a comment. The practical application is coming. But first, I want to address something that might be arising as you take this in. If you're carrying ancestral material, patterns, and memories that you didn't generate through your own experience, what does that mean for your sense of self, for your agency, for the project of working on yourself? Think about it this way. You are not your ancestral patterns any more than you are your personal patterns. The same awareness that witnesses your thoughts and emotions also witnesses the ancestral material moving through your system. Adding a layer of inherited content doesn't change your fundamental nature. It just means there's more content to be aware of. But what does change is this. When you see that some of what you're experiencing wasn't generated by your personal history, you can stop trying to solve it through personal history work alone. This matters. So many people spend years in therapy or spiritual practice trying to trace their patterns back to childhood experiences, and they find genuine material there, certainly. Childhood does shape us profoundly, but some patterns predate childhood. Some material was already installed when you took your first breath. Trying to find the origin of that material in this lifetime is like trying to find your great-grandmother in your baby photos. She influenced you, shaped what was possible for you, but she's not in the pictures. Seeing ancestral origin for certain patterns opens different approaches that work with lineage rather than just personal history. Approaches that can clear material your individual processing alone cannot touch. The Vajrayana Buddhist tradition developed specific practices for this, what they called the purification of karmic inheritance from beginningless time. The recognition that you arrive carrying patterns that accumulated across countless generations and manifestations, requiring methods that address that scale of accumulation. Naropa's 6 yogas include practices specifically designed to work at the level that precedes individual formation. The Dream Yoga component, in particular, provides access to layers of pattern that waking consciousness cannot directly perceive. In Dream, the personal and ancestral begin to blur. Material surfaces that was deposited before your personal history began. But you don't need advanced tantric training to begin working with ancestral material. Seeing clearly is the first and most essential step. Simply understanding that a pattern might be ancestral rather than personal shifts your relationship to it. When you're caught in a fear response, for example, and you understand that this fear might be your grandmother's fear, your great-great-grandfather's fear, suddenly there's space. You're no longer identified with it as your personal neurosis. You're witnessing something that's moving through your system, but didn't originate there. That witnessing, that slight disidentification, is itself transformative. The pattern loses some of its grip when seen as inherited rather than generated. Several practical approaches work together for this kind of work. The first approach involves physical awareness. Ancestral memory shows up in physical patterns, tensions, postural habits, areas of chronic holding or chronic weakness. The research on facial tissue suggests this connective tissue throughout your body carries information. When body workers talk about releases, about memories surfacing during physical manipulation, they're describing the accessing of stored information through physical means. Some of that stored information is personal. Some of it predates personal experience. Working with your body through conscious movement, through breath practices that reach into held areas, through somatic approaches that bring awareness without trying to fix, can surface ancestral material for integration. The second approach is what we might call ancestral inquiry. This is internal work, sensing backward in time rather than analyzing forward from your birth. Sit with a pattern you're working with, a recurring emotional state, a fear, a tendency you can't seem to shake despite understanding its apparent causes. And rather than asking, "When did I learn this?" ask, "How far back does this go?" Feel into the pattern as if it were a thread extending backward through time, through your parents, through their parents, through generations you never met and couldn't name. Don't try to visualize specific ancestors. Simply feel the thread extending backward. pattern having roots that predate your personal formation. This differs from the standard therapeutic approach. Most psychology looks for origin within the individual's history. Ancestral inquiry acknowledges that some patterns have no origin within your history because they arrived before your history began. The third approach involves acknowledgement and release. When you sense that you're carrying material from previous generations, whether it's unprocessed grief or chronic fear or patterns of self-sabotage that don't match your actual circumstances, there's a practice of explicitly acknowledging what you're carrying and releasing what doesn't serve. You're completing what they couldn't complete, processing what they couldn't process, finishing business they were unable to finish in their time. You can think of this as ancestral service. You're healing the lineage when you work with inherited material. What you clear doesn't pass forward to your children or to others in your ancestral field. The buck stops with you, as the saying goes. Consciously metabolized material doesn't need to transmit further. There's another dimension to this that requires careful handling. Just as you inherit burdens, you inherit blessings, capacities, intuitions, strengths that your ancestors developed and deposited for descendants to access. Part of working with ancestral memory involves receiving what was left for you, alongside clearing what weighs on you. Many people in contemporary spiritual culture focus heavily on ancestral wounds, ancestral trauma, ancestral clearing, and that work matters. But it's incomplete without the other side: ancestral gifts, ancestral wisdom, ancestral deposits of spiritual capacity. Kemetic tradition understood this balance. Ancestor veneration meant right relationship with lineage, receiving the gifts while releasing the burdens, honoring what previous generations achieved while not being bound by what they couldn't overcome. In practical terms, this means approaching your ancestral inheritance with curiosity rather than only fear. Asking what wisdom is available to me through my lineage. What did my ancestors want their descendants to have that they themselves couldn't fully access? What seeds did they plant that are ready to sprout in me? The Tamil Siddhas understood something modern science only now approaches. The inherited material can be changed. You don't receive a static deposit of ancestral pattern that you're stuck with forever. The epigenome, the system of bookmarks and margin notes on your DNA, is dynamic. It changes throughout your life based on your experiences, your practices, your development. This is scientifically documented. Meditation practice, for example, has been shown to modify epigenetic markers. The methylation patterns on genes associated with stress response, inflammation, and cellular aging can shift through sustained contemplative practice. You can literally change how your inherited genes express through the quality of attention you bring to your life. What this means practically is that ancestral inheritance provides starting point, not destiny. You receive a certain configuration, a certain set of tendencies and vulnerabilities and capacities based on what your lineage deposited. But what you do with that configuration, how you work with it, whether you reinforce patterns or transform them, that's up to you. The Siddhas developed specific techniques for what they called refinement of the inherited body, working at the subtle level to clear accumulated density, to purify what had been deposited, to transform the base material into something more refined. Their alchemical language described actual work with substance, the substance of the body including its inherited patterning, transforming it through systematic practice. The Kashmir Shaivism tradition offers perhaps the most direct approach to working with all of this. Somananda, who wrote the Shivadrishti, the foundational text of the school, taught that what you're seeking you already are. Applied to ancestral inheritance, this means that the awareness witnessing the ancestral patterns is itself free of those patterns. The patterns appear within awareness. They condition certain expressions. They create tendencies and vulnerabilities. But awareness itself remains untouched by what appears within it. This is the deepest level of working with ancestral material. Beyond clearing the patterns through therapeutic or somatic approaches, beyond acknowledging and releasing through ancestral inquiry, seeing that what you fundamentally are was never conditioned by any of it. The patterns are real. They affect how consciousness expresses through this body-mind system. They're worth working with at the relative level, but at the ultimate level, you are not the patterns. You're the open awareness in which all patterns, personal and ancestral, arise and dissolve. Both levels matter. I'm saying the relative work matters. Clearing genuine burden, receiving genuine gifts, transforming what can be transformed, all of that is legitimate practice. And it's incomplete without the seeing of what's always free. And it's much easier to do the relative work from a ground of seeing than from a ground of identification. When you know you're the space holding the patterns rather than the patterns themselves, working with those patterns becomes less desperate, less contracted, more effective. Right? I'm going to guide you through a practice now. This combines several of the approaches we've discussed. It works with the body, with ancestral sensing, with acknowledgement and release, and with the ground of seeing. Takes about 15 minutes if you do it fully. You can also use parts of it as shorter practices on their own. Find a position where you can be still for a while. Sitting or lying down, whatever allows your body to settle. Let your eyes close if that's comfortable. Begin by feeling your body's weight. Where it presses against the surface beneath you. Just noticing the physical presence of this body you inhabit. Now bring your attention to your bones. The skeletal structure itself. The dense mineral core that holds your shape. The traditions understood bones as holding the deepest layer of ancestral memory. The marrow, the living center of bone where blood cells are made, as a place where lineage deposits itself into individual form. Without trying to feel anything specific, allow your attention to rest with your bones. Your spine. Your skull. The long bones of your arms and legs. What you're doing is establishing connection with a layer of yourself that usually stays unconscious. The substrate on which everything else builds. Now ask, without requiring a verbal answer, how far back does this body extend? time. How many generations are woven into the cells you're feeling right now? Your DNA carries information from every ancestor who contributed to your existence. Thousands of generations. Tens of thousands, if you trace back far enough. All of them present, in some form, in the molecular structure of your cells. Let yourself feel that depth of time condensed into this present form. A thread extending backward through time, through parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, through ancestors whose names are lost, through migrations and settlements and struggles and triumphs. You'll never know consciously. All of it present. In these cells. In this body sitting or lying where you are. Now allow awareness to notice if there's anything heavy in this inheritance. Anything that feels like burden rather than gift. You don't need to name it specifically. Just sense whether there's weight, density, something asking to be released. If you feel nothing, that's fine. No need to manufacture experience. But if something surfaces, some heaviness, some old pattern that seems to stretch back before your personal history, acknowledge it. Silently, you might say something like, I sense what I'm carrying from before my own time. I acknowledge what was deposited that no longer serves. I'm willing to complete what previous generations couldn't complete. words carry intention. You're communicating with your own deep structure, setting direction for transformation. And then, imagine whatever heaviness you sensed beginning to dissolve, through allowing rather than force. Like salt dissolving in warm water. The pattern losing its grip. The density becoming less dense. Whatever image works for you, use it. The key is allowing rather than forcing. Now shift to receiving. Your ancestors left you more than burden. They left you capacity, wisdom, gifts they earned through their own development and wanted their descendants to have. Without trying to specify what those gifts might be, simply open to receiving what your lineage deposited as blessing. Strengths that came too naturally to explain. Intuitions that seem to come from nowhere. Capacities that feel older than this life. You might silently acknowledge, I receive what my ancestors intended for me. What they developed through their own efforts and passed forward as gift. Let that intention settle into your bones, into your cells, into the deep structure that carries ancestral information. Now, the final movement. Having worked with the ancestral content, turn attention to what's aware of all of it. Notice that you've been present throughout this entire process. Something has been here, aware of the body, aware of the bones, aware of the sensing backward through time, aware of the releasing and receiving. What is that awareness? Where is it located? Can you find its edges? Turn toward the one who's been aware of everything, toward the subject itself. You might notice that awareness has no age, no ancestry, no genetic inheritance. It's the space in which all inherited content appears, but it doesn't carry the content. It's free of what it holds. Rest here for a moment. As the awareness that witnesses both ancestral burden and ancestral gift, both the inherited patterns and the clear space that holds them. This is what you fundamentally are. The awareness in which all inheritance appears. When you're ready, let your eyes open. Feel the room around you. The ordinary world you inhabit. But perhaps you carry the understanding that this body you inhabit also carries worlds, generations, accumulated memory extending back through more time than you can conceive. And underneath all of it, awareness that is no time at all. That practice can be repeated whenever you sense ancestral material surfacing. Over time, repeated engagement with this work shifts your relationship to inherited patterns permanently. Understanding that you carry ancestral memory, having a working relationship with that memory, ability to clear what doesn't serve, receive what does, and rest in the awareness that's always free, regardless of content. To bring this together with a few summary points. First, this is science. The field of epigenetics has established beyond reasonable doubt that experience modifies gene expression, and those modifications transmit across generations. Your ancestors' lives shaped your biology. Their trauma, their adaptations, their skills, their wisdom, all of it left marks that express through your cells right now. Second, contemplative traditions understood this before the science caught up. The Kemetic practitioners working with Ka transmission, the Tamil Siddhas developing practices for ancestral purification, the Kashmir Shaivists teaching about accumulated tendency shaping manifestation, the Vajrayana Buddhists speaking of karmic inheritance from beginningless time, all of them saw what modern research now validates. Third, ancestral inheritance provides starting point, not destiny. The epigenome is dynamic, responsive to your practices and your development. What you received can be transformed. What burdens you can be cleared. What gifts were deposited can be activated and integrated. Fourth, the deepest work goes beyond clearing or receiving at the content level. Seeing what you are beyond all inherited content. The awareness that holds everything, touched by nothing. That seeing makes all the relative work easier and more effective. This matters for lineage moving forward. What you process doesn't pass on. What you integrate becomes available as gift rather than burden for those who come after you. Whether you have biological children or not, you're part of ancestral fields that affect others in your lineage. Your work serves more than yourself. If this transmission served you, subscribe. We do this consistently, quality content on these topics, multiple times per week, and share this with someone you think is ready for it. Someone who's been working with patterns that don't seem to trace back to their personal history. Someone who might benefit from understanding that what they're carrying came from far before their birth. What's the one insight from this that's staying with you? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious what's landing. You are here at this moment, in this body, with this particular constellation of ancestral memory moving through your cells. The exact configuration you received, the specific blend of burden and gift, challenge and capacity, is precisely what creates the curriculum of your particular life. And underneath it all, before any of it, untouched by any of it, awareness that is simply aware, holding the generations, holding the body that the generations built, holding the one who thinks they're the body, holding even the thought of holding. That's what you are. That's what was never born and cannot die. That's what you're looking from rather than looking for. The memories of your ancestors lives in your DNA. Yes, molecular fact. And you are the awareness in which all those memories appear, transform, and dissolve. Both are true. Work with both. Let the relative work clear what needs clearing. Receive what's offered. Transform what can be transformed. And let the ultimate seeing ground you in what needs no clearing, no receiving, no transformation. What you are was complete before your ancestors existed, and it holds them all now, here, in the cells that carry their memory and the awareness that carries everything.